Oh, the world today is fragile. Stability is shaken. Tensions are on the rise. I mean, it's hard to list all the destabilizing factors that are occurring in the world. We could start with the big ones, the ones that pose planetary destruction on a scale we haven't really grappled with as a human species. We have an intensifying climate crisis. That is introducing instability into almost all areas of the world. We have a raging pandemic now about to enter its third year, again, introducing major instability. Of course, we have the increasing globalization, which has been very beneficial for some people in the world and has created an enormous amount of wealth over the last 20 or 30 years, but it has also led to income inequities that have left large portions of the world population behind, while a few have benefited from this globalization. That is causing increased instability in the world. And now, of course, you have the changes that have resulted from the U.S. foreign policy system, national security, domestic political system being in upheaval over the last 4 years or more, until you have serious structural problems inside the United States. The leader, it likes to think, of the international rule-based order. And if the United States is shaking, is unstable in its political futures, of course, that's going to have repercussions throughout. And now, of course, you have the Brexit controversy, the instability in Europe. So no, there is no shortage of crises, both planetary and national, that are increasing instability in the world today. U.S.-Russian relations today are terrible and getting worse. I've rarely seen them this bad, and I've been in Washington for about 40 years. I got involved in national security politics because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was perhaps the low point of U.S.-Russian relations in the past 50 years. And today I'm seeing a repeat of some of those patterns. Intense U.S. suspicions of Russian motives, for example, in massing troops on the Ukraine border. Intense Russian suspicions about U.S. motives as it tries to help Ukraine. We see both of those countries maintaining the two largest stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Each has about 2,000 operationally deployed hydrogen bombs, many of those on hair trigger alert, ready to launch at a moment's notice. So this is a crisis not just for the U.S. and Russia, but a conflict between the U.S. and Russia could have global catastrophic consequences. So I'm afraid that relations are bad, and I don't see any immediate prospects for helping them get better, despite the increase in dialogue that is beginning between the two nations. Yes, in recent days, we've seen an increase in diplomacy between the United States and Russia. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with the foreign minister of Russia. There are efforts to try to set up a phone call between President Biden and President Putin. But on the ground, tensions are growing. Both sides are taking military maneuvers. Russia moving troops closer to the Ukraine border, issuing ominous warnings of the tensions in the region. The United States moving naval units into the area. Both say that their main concern is threats from the other side, but this is precisely the kind of conflict that makes you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin crisis. That is incidents in the past where maneuvers around one piece on the chessboard intensify, and each side starts moving more and more pieces into play to try to bolster their position. The risk is that diplomacy fails and people feel the need to go to the next step to take what each side would call a forceful response. And that could lead to a shooting conflict involving Russian troops and perhaps Ukrainian forces that would quickly bring in the forces, perhaps of the United States, perhaps of NATO, even though there's no defensive alliance relationship with Ukraine. People see this conflict as so pivotal to U.S. Russia relations, to European security, that neither side is willing to back down. That is precisely the situation you had in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Each side felt they couldn't back down, that their only choice was to escalate in the hope that the other side would back down. And of course, each side is armed with nuclear weapons, not just strategic nuclear weapons that can span the oceans, but tactical nuclear weapons that could be used in a crisis. So yes, the crisis with Ukraine may appear in the middle pages of your newspaper, but this is a top international security threat. I don't see a resolution in sight. If President Putin and President Biden can have that phone call, that might be a good thing. But it all depends on what the attitude of the two leaders are. I can tell you in Washington, we get daily columns, daily op-eds warning that we have to take a forceful stance against Putin, that warning that any concessions to President Putin would be seen as appeasement and would only encourage him. These are kind of normal in Washington, but they're piling up now. And President Biden is in such a tender political moment that I fear that he will believe, despite his core instincts, which are for diplomacy, for compromise, he might fear looking weak in this confrontation, raising the stakes, leading us ever closer to a misstep that could result in a military conflict that neither side really wants. The Biden administration would like to have a new round of arms control talks with Russia. They'd also like to have start the process of these kinds of talks with China. So yes, this is part of the agenda. And I've had the privilege of knowing now President Biden when he was a senator. This was a man that from his earliest days in the Senate was interested in arms control, was worried about the nuclear arms race, is intimately familiar with these details. He may be the most accomplished arms control president the United States has ever elected. He understands these treaties. He understands the dangers. So yes, I think he would like to work out a path with Russia that could be in both countries' mutual interest. For example, a treaty that would reduce the number of strategic nuclear weapons and might lead to withdrawal of some of the U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. I don't know how President Putin feels about this. I would argue that this would be arrangements that would mutually benefit both countries. But it remains to be seen. It's an open question. It's clearly on President Biden's agenda. It's an area he would like to explore. I don't know whether the crisis in Ukraine will prevent that from happening. We are at a pivotal point in the effort to reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. Because of the diplomacy between the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia, we have walked back from the brink of Cold War terrors. In the 1980s, when I started work on Capitol Hill on the House Armed Services Committee staff, we had about 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. Because of the diplomacy, first it began with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, we've seen those stockpiles come steadily down. They've been reduced by over 85%. So the global stockpile of nuclear weapons is now at about 13,000. Down from a peak of about 70,000. That's a remarkable reduction. Most of those weapons are held by the United States and Russia, who have about 93% of all the nuclear weapons in the world, but it's flatlined. The last nuclear reduction treaty was the New START Treaty back in 2010. There's been no other treaty since then. There's no talks about new treaties then. And so the US and Russian stockpiles have flatlined here, and they may start to tick up. Both the US and Russia are concerned about what's going on in China. You hear calls in the United States that we have to match China now, as a country that has only 300 nuclear weapons compared to the 5,000 that the US has, the almost 6,000 that Russia has. But these kinds of international competitions are exactly what triggers an arms race. So we might see this trend start to go back up again, exactly the opposite of what people want. So that's why it's so critical that the US and Russia begin talks again. And a reduction treaty would be easy for the United States and Russia. Let me just give you one example. Back in 2013, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the leaders of the US military services, conducted a study on nuclear weapons military requirements. And they concluded that the US could reduce its nuclear force, its strategic nuclear force, by 1/3, that they could go down from the New START limits of 1,550 operationally deployed nuclear weapons down to 1,000. They could cut that force by 1/3 unilaterally, no matter what Russia did. They could do this on their own and still meet all military requirements. This is largely the result of improvements in US nuclear weapons. They are more accurate. The fusing has changed to make them more powerful in each explosion, so they could hit all the targets they need to hit with 1/3 fewer weapons. I would bet that Russia is in a similar situation, that it has more weapons than it has targets. So you could easily see a new treaty take a 1/3 cut. Why is that important? Because once you get the US and Russia down to about 1,000 deployed nuclear weapons, that really opens the door for discussions with the other nuclear armed states. China with its 300, France with about 350, the United Kingdom with about 200. You could see bringing those countries into a multilateral process where we would talk about strategic stability, about freezing the number of nuclear weapons in those states while continuing reductions in the United States and Russia. You might even be able to get China to agree to some kind of strategic stability talks in the long run in Asia with India and Pakistan. So you could see how this going down, the US and Russian reductions, could pave the way and open the door and create the conditions for the first real multilateral, multi-nation nuclear freeze and reduction talks. But the US and Russia have to take the first step. It's not going to come from any of the other nuclear armed nations. The US and Russia have been the largest forces, have been the most active diplomatic forces on nuclear policy for decades now. They have to return to this leadership role and forge a path. Yes and no. China, for many, many years, has had a policy that they call minimum deterrence, which is that they develop nuclear weapons for the reason, frankly, most countries have developed nuclear weapons. They thought it was necessary for their security. They were worried about the United States and later about the Soviet Union. They tested their first weapon in 1964 as a deterrent to prevent nuclear armed countries from threatening China or from attacking China and using a nuclear advantage to gain a military advantage. But they've always felt that they didn't need that many. They never felt the need to duplicate the size of the Russian and US arsenals, which had grown to insane proportions. I mean, we look back now and we think, why did we need 20,000 nuclear weapons? It seems insane, but for years, that's what the Soviet military and that's what the US military said they absolutely had to have. The Chinese never felt that way. So that right now, China has about 100 missiles that could deliver about 130 warheads to the continental United States. That is plenty of nuclear warheads. They don't need any more warheads to deter us. China's nuclear force deters us. No U.S. official will contemplate military action against China without taking into account China's nuclear force. Just a fact of military life. They don't need any more than that. One nuclear weapon on one city would be a level of destruction the world hasn't seen since the end of World War II. 10 nuclear weapons on 10 cities would be a catastrophe beyond human experience. We've never seen destruction on that scale. 100 nuclear weapons is almost unimaginable. But that's what the Chinese have now. That's what they could do now. Why are they increasing their force? It's not because they think they need to have more weapons that could hit the United States. It's that they think they need to have more weapons that could survive a U.S. first strike. That's what's going on. Because U.S. nuclear weapons are so numerous, and because they have gotten better over the last 10, 20 years, more accurate, and because conventional weapons are now more accurate, and in some cases could actually fulfill a mission that was previously allocated to nuclear weapons. That is, for example, might be able to take out an ICBM silo or an ICBM launching facility where previously a nuclear weapon had been assigned to that. Chinese and Russians, by the way, fear that the U.S. might be tempted into a first strike, believing that they could launch enough nuclear weapons to take out China's forces and create a defensive system of missile interceptors that could destroy, neutralize any remaining Chinese missiles. That's what's going on. China feels that it needs to respond to this increased offensive threat from the United States and an increased attempt to build a defensive shield. Now, I don't believe these defenses work. I don't believe U.S. missile defenses work. Believe me, I have investigated missile defenses for over 30 years. It was my first assignment when I was a staffer on the House Armed Services Committee in the 1980s. I looked at these systems in depth. There is no reliable long-range interceptor against a ballistic missile. It's just too easy to spoof, overwhelm, jam, etc. We don't have it. But if you're a Russian or a Chinese and you see the U.S. spending $20 billion a year, that's what we spend, $20 billion a year on what we call U.S. missile defense and defeat systems, you have to think that the U.S. either believes that it has the defensive system that works or might soon invent a defensive system that works. So your force has to be robust enough, large enough to survive a first strike attempt and have enough missiles to go and penetrate U.S. missile defenses. That's why the Chinese are increasing their ICBM silos. That's why the Chinese are testing hypervelocity glide vehicles. And the same is true for Russia, by the way. Vladimir Putin has said this. In 2002, when the United States withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, Putin warned then President George W. Bush, don't do this. If you do this, it will require me, Putin, to build more offensive systems. We didn't listen. And as President Putin said 4 or 5 years ago when he unveiled these new Russian super weapons, he called them, he said, you didn't listen then, maybe you'll listen now. This is the arms race. One side tries to get an advantage by building up offenses, by creating defensive systems. The other side has to respond, and it just ratchets up. We're in this dynamic again. That's why new arms control treaties are so important. That's why strategic stability talks are so important. That's why a crisis like Ukraine has to be resolved in a diplomatic, peaceful compromise acceptable to both, so that you can start to ratchet back from this insanity that has brought us to the brink of nuclear war many times before and may bring us to that brink again. This is part of the other good news about nuclear weapons. There are far fewer countries in the world that want nuclear weapons now. In the 1960s, we were looking at 20, 25 countries that either had nuclear weapons programs or were exploring nuclear weapons programs. Many countries since then have ended those programs. Some countries have had nuclear weapons and given them up, like South Africa, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, even Iraq and Libya ended their nuclear programs with some encouragement. So we're really down to two cases. North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, which is the only country to have tested nuclear weapons in the 21st century, the only country that have started a weapons program after the entry into force of the Non-proliferation Treaty, and Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons, but is steadily building up the capability where it could possibly make nuclear weapons. Those are the only two. If you can solve those two, you might be looking at the end of proliferation. There are no other countries you're really worried about. But if you don't solve those two, if North Korea continues to keep its nuclear arsenal expanded, if Iran were to appear to be heading towards a nuclear weapon, both of those could trigger reactions in their regions. There's no question that South Korea and Japan feel more internal political pressure to build nuclear weapons because of North Korea. There's no question that Saudi Arabia is looking at nuclear options because of what's happening with Iran. Even Turkey, maybe even Egypt, which used to have a nuclear program, might re-examine this. So you have to solve these problems in order to prevent the proliferation of new programs. I'm optimistic about this. I think there are actually solutions to both of these. I think the Iran and the other powers that are now negotiating will come up with a deal, but it's critical. It's not just about that country. It's not just about that region. It's whether our global efforts to stop the spread of these weapons will succeed or not. This is another pivot point we face over the next few years. Yes, I believe it can be. I think we've been heading towards the elimination of nuclear weapons since Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev negotiated the landmark START treaty. I think that's where we're going. Remember, it was in the late 1980s that we came very close to an agreement between the then Soviet Union and the United States to eliminate all nuclear weapons. There's really sort of a consensus at very high levels of thinking that this would be a good thing, that it would be good to eliminate nuclear weapons, that we'd be better off without nuclear weapons. But you get doubts about whether it's feasible, whether you really can do it. The only way to know if it's feasible is to continue the reductions. There is no reason for the United States and Russia to have arsenals this large. You may not agree with me that nuclear weapons are immoral. That's what I believe. That's what Pope Francis believes. That's what most religious leaders believe, that no nation should threaten the mass annihilation of innocent men, women, and children because of political differences they might have with another country. No nation should do that. Nuclear weapons are immoral. We should eliminate them. They shouldn't exist, just the way poison gas shouldn't exist, just the way biological weapons shouldn't exist. We should get rid of these things the way we have or almost done between the international treaties on chemical and biological weapons. You may not agree with me, but surely we could agree that we don't need thousands of these nuclear weapons, that we could go down to hundreds. And once you get down to that level, then you really are in the world where the elimination might look practical, that you can imagine steps, mutual reductions down to tens of nuclear weapons and eventually towards their elimination. And the fact is that these weapons seem to be more of an historical accident rather than a necessity. You know, if the World War II had ended a few months earlier, we might never have had nuclear weapons. We certainly don't need them in the current world. Most countries say the only reason they have them is because other countries have them and are threats. So if you can arrive at a formula where you mutually walk back to smaller and smaller numbers, yes, I think you can imagine a world in decades of time, Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but maybe by the end of this decade, by the beginning of the next decade, where you could see a steady march. And you see countries already taking that road with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Over 54 countries have already ratified this treaty. There is an international treaty saying nuclear weapons are illegal. There are some countries that are already moving in this direction. I think this is a trend that is a very powerful and evocative trend for many people around the world. I'm optimistic that in the medium term, we will see this trend grow. We will see further reductions in nuclear weapons if we can get through this critical pivot point of the next couple of years. We should have a regular dialogue between the United States and Russia. It shouldn't be a elaborate choreography to get a phone call between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. It shouldn't be this hard. We need regular talks in this regard. The United States has to start engaging China in strategic stability talks, which we've never done before. So yes, we can do this. We have to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation treaty at the review conference. The U.S. should cut its nuclear budget. I think the U.S. can take the lead. We could take unilateral steps that would set an example for the rest of the world. President Biden always says this. We should lead by the power of our example, not the example of our power. That is true for nuclear weapons as well. President Biden has a unique opportunity to change U.S. nuclear weapons policy and programs and budgets with the upcoming nuclear posture review. I'm pessimistic that he will do that, I have to tell you. I think the nuclear bureaucracy in the United States and in other countries is so strong that it's preserving itself, it's enriching itself at the expense of the nation. And I'm afraid that President Biden is not bold enough to take the kinds of steps that he believes in. If Joe Biden was allowed to be Joe Biden, we would have a very different U.S. nuclear policy. But I don't think he's willing to invest the political capital to challenge the contracts, the contractors. The secret about nuclear weapons really isn't their power. It's that some people get rich making nuclear weapons. This is a product for several big companies in the United States. They get billions of dollars every year by making nuclear weapons, and they don't want to stop that. So in order to change policy, you don't just write a nuclear posture review. You have to confront those corporations and say, we're going to shrink your contracts. And we have to face those lobbyists who are lobbying members of Congress and members of the administration and fight them in a battle over money. It's not just about policy. It's about who gets rich from nuclear weapons and who's at risk from nuclear weapons. So the outlook is unclear. I honestly don't know who's going to win this fight. When you have billions of dollars at stake, unfortunately, we've seen countries usually make terrible decisions in favor of giving the money to these contractors, and rather than taking it away and establishing a sound policy. The problem you have with nuclear weapons is they don't exist in a vacuum. So we've discussed already the various tensions like Ukraine that could lead to military escalation that could escalate to nuclear. But there's other threats that are emerging, including space and cyber right now. And these don't exist in a just side by side in different silos. They interact with each other. Let me give you an example. The cyber threat is growing. People are getting more and more capable of attacking other countries with cyber weapons. And since we, the United States, introduced the Stuxnet virus to penetrate the Iranian centrifuges and take control of those centrifuges, countries have increasingly turned from cyber warfare that just spies on you, gets your credit card information or your data, and to ones that actually take over physical systems and can take control of physical systems like we did with centrifuges, and that you could do with air traffic control, with stock markets, with dams, with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not immune to this. There's no magic about nuclear weapons. And many people have now done studies showing that the threat is that someone could hack into Russian or U.S. nuclear command and control systems and prevent them from working. So when you push the button, nothing happens. And worse, when you don't push the button, something does happen, or you could be spoofed. There have been numerous incidents when both Russian and U.S. Early warning systems have thought that the country was under attack. Most recently, 1995, the Boris Yeltsin was told that the U.S. had launched a ballistic missile from the Barents Sea and was attacking Russia. And the Russian military came to him and opened the nuclear football and told him we had to launch the weapons. That's how close we came as recently as 1995, when we had great relations between the US and Russia. So you could see a hacker do that kind of thing intentionally. And so the interrelation of cyber and space, putting nuclear weapons in orbit, is once again a discussion that's underway. Blinding early warning satellites in space, all these increase the risk of miscalculation, of accident, or of intentional sabotage of countries' nuclear weapons, maybe not by another nation state, but by a third party. A non-state actor could actually trigger a nuclear war now in a way they never could before. So the risks are growing. We have the diplomatic instruments in place. The Non-proliferation Treaty is one of the most effective security arrangements ever negotiated. And around that have built a global system of restraints and weapons bans, sanctions, security assurances that have worked. You have to understand that this policy has basically worked. It's been slower than any of us wanted, but it's basically worked in reducing the number of nuclear weapons, reducing the spread of these weapons in the world. But we're at a pivot point where it's not clear that these mechanisms can be carried forward, that they can be creatively added to and improved at this point. I think what's missing now is political will. I think for the elites of most countries, for the publics of most countries, they still think of nuclear weapons as a problem that's been solved. They think all this sort of went away with the end of the Cold War. Well, the Cold War is over, but the weapons remain. We may not think about them. We don't think about them in the same terms as climate change and pandemics, but these pose an existential threat, a planetary threat. And unless we keep our attention on them, that threat is going to grow. And it'd be a shame if that happened, because we're so close to being able to continue the processes and add to them. So what we need are things like the Luxembourg Forum is doing, to keep attention on this issue, keep reminding these people that you may not see nuclear weapons, you may not think about nuclear weapons, but they are there. They are a danger that could destroy in an afternoon everything that humanity has created over the millennia. And instead of building new and better nuclear weapons, we should be building new and better diplomatic measures for destroying nuclear weapons and working towards their eventual elimination. I am guardedly optimistic that the efforts of many people around the world, like the Luxembourg Forum, like the Quincy Institute, like many members in parliaments around the world, will coalesce into an agreement that we need to have our national security policies put diplomacy first and military as a tool of last resort. And that especially applies to nuclear weapons, where these should be reduced and reduced and reduced, and not seen as the core of our national security strategy or the bedrock of our national security strategy, but as obsolete instruments of a global war that we no longer should be contemplating fighting. That these are weapons that have to be controlled, reduced, and eventually eliminated, not enshrined as the leading elements of national security, of national strength.